Thanks very much, Elaine, and thank you to all of you for the invitation to be here this evening and participate in Soul of the City. For one reason or another, I find myself coming to Calgary now almost every month, and it's been, you should add Calgary to that list in the introduction. It's a city where I've done some work. I work, for example, on the Riverwalk next to the East Village, and it's been really thrilling to see it actually happen and come to life. So what I want to talk to you about tonight in terms of Soul of the City is a wonderful kind of convergence which is happening now as, in a certain way, we are rediscovering cities. And I have to take you very briefly back before moving forward because we are now responding to an extraordinary paradigm shift, which is in itself a reaction to the one that occurred right after World War II, when what we did in that first round is to abandon our skills as city builders, because throughout North America, we were great city builders. If you look at downtowns, at the quality of urban architecture, at the way we were being inventive in terms of combining uses, the kinds of public transportation we were developing all across North America up until the Second World War. All of a sudden after the war, building on a momentum that had developed just prior, and you see here in this image of the 1939 World's Fair Pavilion that General Motors put together in New York, there was a new idea which really was that cities were obsolete and we needed to move on to something else. About 14 million people saw that pavilion. It was perhaps the most influential pavilion of any that has ever appeared in a World's Fair, and it altered the face of the planet in terms of where we live. On the left is a little clip from a film called Radiant City, which I don't know how many of you have seen, which is about this city. I was fortunate enough to have a kind of bit part in that film, but I think we all know that as this paradigm spread through 2.5 generations, which was really a blip in the millennial life of cities, or in fact multi-millennial life of cities, it has turned out to be problematic. And as quickly as it established itself, as you see in this Life magazine cover from 1960, all of the highways that we built that were the conduits to lead people out of cities filled up. The collateral damage that we were doing to the environment began to accumulate. We've inherited a public health crisis, especially with children who get driven from place to place, who no longer get themselves to school by themselves, and so we have levels of obesity, heart disease, diabetes in kids that we've never seen before. And if all that were not enough, of course, we are now in the early stages of peak oil, which is the game changer. And if you think back to 1950, gasoline in North America was about 18 cents a gallon, and there was the expectation that that energy at that cost would be available indefinitely. Well, of course, we know many things have changed. So round two is really interesting. This is a delayed aftershock as all of the assumptions underlying that first huge paradigm shift come into play. And what's now really exciting is that cities around the world are all innovating in creating great new 21st century neighborhoods. It began, of course, with the reoccupation, reappropriation of the older neighborhoods, the pre-war neighborhoods, but now people are moving on and figuring out how to make new places in their cities. So this range of examples from Boston, Cambridge, where I worked on North Point, upper left, Vancouver, Yaletown, which you probably know, Hammarby Sjöstad outside Stockholm, Tolbiac in Paris. There are examples like this appearing in cities all around the world all of which exhibit a bunch of themes and characteristics that I'm going to try and get into quickly. But the main thing that is driving this, which is quite phenomenal, is that there is a whole cohort of young people especially, but not only young people, but young people from Generation X to Generation Y to the millennials who are voting with their feet and really opting for urban places, not for any great ideological reasons or explicitly political reasons, but simply because they find this the key to a more satisfying life, very much like what your previous speaker was suggesting. So the American dream, the North American dream that we all grew up with, or many of us in this room, some of us perhaps are in that younger category who never were excited about this, but my family certainly went through that. That has lost its luster, and it's been replaced with a new and very potent North American dream, which is about living in a neighborhood where you can walk to buy your groceries, where you can take a bicycle, where you can have access to transit, where all the things in your daily life are actually close. And if you can do that, you are seen to be successful. So some of the stats that are showing up are really interesting. A phenomenon called demotorization is occurring throughout the developed world, where the number of kilometers traveled by car is decreasing year by year. It's really interesting on the right that in terms of people getting licenses, which was a rite of passage for my generation, the cohort from age 16 to 34 in North America now has 26% of that age group who choose never to get driver's licenses. They're just not interested. It's not a priority. What they relate to emotionally is this. It's not the automobile, and it's taken on a whole different meaning. These are a couple of curves that are crossing, which is really interesting, as tracked by the Brookings Institute in Washington in a 2012 study. Walkable places, older neighborhoods and mature neighborhoods in the dark blue, are actually gaining in a rate of growth in terms of units being produced. These are not absolute numbers. This is change at the margin, which is a really telling figure, whereas new dwelling units being constructed that are in drivable but not walkable neighborhoods, all the top lines in that chart, are actually decreasing, and these two curves are crossing. So this is a really interesting time to be thinking about the issues that you have identified. And what's great is that cities are incredibly resilient. I spent about 15 years working with the city of St. Paul in Minnesota and watched it go through an amazing transformation, working with 3 mayors, Republicans and Democrats, interestingly enough, where it had climaxed in a certain form where you had a central business district surrounded by a sea of surface parking lots, pretty familiar in North America, and where the city has taken enormous strides to reconnect itself to its origins on the Mississippi River, greening the city and infilling the city with new neighborhoods and taking on an entirely different form. And so the transformation that took place in St. Paul is being echoed all across the continent, both in the hearts of cities and on the suburban fringe. These two transformations are happening in parallel, and they're happening in directions which are very similar. And a lot of it has to do with colonizing the parking lots. That area that I'm showing you on the left is where I began, where I cut my teeth as an urban designer in the city of Toronto, starting in the late 1970s. That looked like that image of St. Paul with all the parking lots when I started there. It's now a wonderful, active, vibrant, mixed-use neighborhood. The one on the right is Bank Street in Ottawa, a 3.5-kilometer corridor, which is going through the same kind of transformation, where I've been working more recently. The key is that everything is connected, that the term sustainability, which at first we were using as a kind of technological fix overlaid on what we were already doing, is really not only about how we consume energy and dispose of our waste and all of the things we think about in those terms, but it's also about everything we do and how all these things are connected to each other. And one of the key components is now this emerging DNA of sustainable places, where every part of every new place that we retrofit or we make should have places where people are working, where people are living, where they can do their shopping, public spaces they can share, access to new forms of mobility, all of the recreation, the cultural life, the things that go into making great places. To get there, what's really exciting from a professional standpoint is all the old hierarchies are breaking down. This is what my workday looks like. I'm standing around a table with architects, landscape architects, economists, ecologists, artists, social animators, people, hydrologists, people from all different fields collaborating and working together with flattened hierarchies, with lateral thinking, breaking out of all of the old stereotypes. And if we're able to do that, cities have the capacity, by moving from just thinking about individual buildings to thinking about whole areas, to actually move to what's called net plus, where we're actually putting energy back into the grid. We're taking energy from all kinds of sources in the city. So instead of being energy hogs and vast exporters of CO2 emissions into the environment, there's a whole different way in which cities can behave. We have the technologies. It's a matter of harnessing them. Another key aspect of this, which I gather Doug will be talking about as well, is a whole different idea about the city in nature, seeing ourselves as part of nature, not separate from, not dominating nature, understanding this is the Toronto region and the watercourses, the rivers, the creeks, the recharge area in the Oak Ridges Moraine, the Niagara Escarpment, the Lake Ontario shoreline, are all part and parcel of the urban world. And this is a project that I worked on. We're dealing with floodproofing in the Lower Don, where the Don River comes into Toronto Harbor, was an opportunity for parks creation, for habitat formation, for a whole bunch of things being done simultaneously through that way of thinking more synthetically about problem solving. So we are getting denser and more compact, but it's not just about building a lot of condominiums or office buildings. Toronto, as you may know, is experiencing an unbelievable building boom. There are something like 190 cranes on the sky in the downtown area now, notwithstanding the recession. And we are building as much as the next 5 cities in North America, including Mexico City, combined. But that itself is no guarantee of success, and it's no guarantee of sustainability, because it's not just making it dense, it's how you make it dense. It's what happens at street level. It's the things that go into neighborhood building, into community building. And this brings a host of new challenges. We have to get to much greater mix. For those of you who are developers in the room or involved in the financing of development, we have to get out of the silos. We have to get away from the set of standard isolated products to thinking about building neighborhoods that actually have housing for people of different incomes, different stages in their life, different tenure options, along with places to work, along with places to shop, all these things combined. And so this is a challenge to designers. It's a challenge to the entire food chain that's involved in making places. On the left is something I did for a very successful life science developer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a master plan. And it was done in a way that rather than being a science park, it was combined with a host of other uses, including live entertainment, hotel, residential, restaurants, cafes, to recruit and retain those top scientists. The last thing they wanted to do is to walk out of their labs, which you see there, and be surrounded by other lab buildings. They wanted to be in a lively, interesting part of the city. The example you see on the right is a kind of layering and intricacy that we're getting back to, where you have a pedestrian street, you have a level of shops and cafes, you have people working above that, you have people living above that. We have to think about making places that work for people of all ages, of all abilities, of all stages in their life, not just aiming at narrowly focused cohorts. Again, this is a big challenge for the development industry. And perhaps the biggest and most interesting challenge of all, and the biggest problem on our plates for the next 50 years, is how do we retrofit the vast suburban world where something like 2/3 of the North American population is now living. And that is happening. That's the exciting part. This is Mississauga, and you see Square One, which was a regional shopping mall built around 1960. Hazel McCallion, whom you may have heard of, who's in her 90s, who was a wonderful mayor. She's been mayor for about 30 years. She presided over the creation of a totally automobile-oriented suburb of 700,000 people. She is now the biggest advocate for making the shift, for admitting there was a huge mistake in building that kind of world. And so what's happening is light rail is coming in the form of bus rapid transit and fixed rail, and all of these parking lots are being colonized. The arteries, these vast suburban arteries which you see there, have already been planned for this kind of intensification. So the transformation of suburbia is not easy. It's happening in many ways, but it is happening. And we have to get over the idea that there's some kind of dichotomy between the suburban world and the urban world. These are part and parcel of the same thing. They're highly intertwined. The new economy is upon us, and even in a city like Calgary, where you have such a dependence on energy and oil and gas and so on, it behooves you to think about diversification. And this is an interesting example. This is where I live in Toronto, King Spadina, King Parliament, and 400 acres that were formerly manufacturing on both sides of downtown have been transformed. And as tens of thousands of new people have come to live in this area, what you see in the bar chart is the loss of manufacturing jobs on the right being replaced by all these other different kinds of jobs which build on the critical mass of each contributing to others. So it's design, it's new media, it's high tech, it's health sciences. All these things build on a cluster of talented people who live there. That's very important. The jobs are chasing where people are living. But also what's so interesting is how they are adapting and reusing the old buildings and the new. This is a classic Jane Jacobs argument about the value of buildings of a mix of ages and having enterprises of all sizes interconnected and supporting each other. Another very key component of all this is changing the way we move. And you wouldn't know this necessarily if you walk out the door and see the volume of traffic on 10th Avenue. But what we're moving toward very rapidly, and this goes back to my statistic about people having driver's licenses, is a world where we will have all these choices for mobility and not have to own them. Bicycle sharing now exists in over 100 cities in the world, and it's increasing all the time. All the different forms of car share, the use of our handheld devices to have access to all forms of transportation and to be able to track them in real time. The retrofitting of streets which we now call complete streets, where yes, we do have private automobiles, but where the hierarchy has been reversed, where what comes first are pedestrians, cyclists, and transit, and there's a place for everyone in the right-of-way. And so these transformations are happening in city after city, where we're combining the old pleasures of walkability with the latest technologies in terms of transportation, and a new legibility in the public environment in terms of separate signals for pedestrians and cyclists and clearly delineated crosswalks, and a whole new attention to how we move around the city. A key tip-off is how kids get to school. And I came upon this schoolyard in Stockholm, and I was just delighted to see all these tiny bicycles, because that just speaks volumes about how the parents and the kids in that neighborhood, it was an urban neighborhood, feel about the safety of the streets in their neighborhood. And you can see, maybe you can't see, but what the chart on the right shows is that in Scandinavia, some 75 to 80% of the kids get themselves to school by themselves. In the UK, it's about 45. In Canada, it's about 25 in red, and the US, it's 12. So this goes back to the public health issue. We have to not be afraid to experiment, to try things. This is the famous case of Janet Sadiq-Khan, the Commissioner of Transportation in New York City, going to Copenhagen, seeing what was happening there, coming back, talking to Mike Bloomberg, and 6 weeks later, doing temporary streetscaping on Broadway from 23rd Street up to 59th Street, and enabling people to sit out in tables and chairs in Times Square. And it was such a success, of course, that it's there, and many of you have probably been able to experience it. There are issues here, again, on the theme of this all being connected, of health and equity. This is a map of my city, Toronto, and as it gets darker, it gets less walkable. Well, guess what? The pre-World War II city is highly walkable. The post-war suburbs are not. And this was produced by the medical officer of health, because that's where the highest incidence of all those public health problems is occurring. And not surprisingly, this is another study done by a demographer at the University of Toronto, David Holchansky, who shows that from 1970 to 2005, and this is a problem which is coming with this success of the city, the people of means moved into the heart of the city, occupying that pre-World War II city, and poverty, which was in red, has been exported in 35 years from the city center to those first-ring suburbs. So this poses some really serious challenges in terms of access to transit, food deserts, all of the things that come along with that. Another key component of this is commitment to the public realm, to the spaces we share. And this is that area in King Spadina that I showed you, which has been so intensely redeveloped. And there's a plan that runs along with that, that improves the squares, the parks, the pedestrian connection, breaks down the big blocks, adds new public spaces, which you see here. In our urban world in Canada in particular, where we are such a heterogeneous society, we need places where we go eyeball to eyeball with each other, where we meet, where we share this common ground. It's extremely important. It's also a fascinating time in terms of reconnecting with the great natural features, which are often the reason why our cities are where they are in the first place. And I've been privileged to work on a number of great waterfront projects like the Brooklyn Bridge Park, which you see in the slides above, the Humber River Bridge in Toronto below, the Great Chicago waterfront. This is being repeated everywhere. But what's so interesting is as this happens, and Calgary, I think, is a fantastic example with Princess Island and now St. Patrick's Island and the Riverwalk and all the connections that are being developed around the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow, the city becomes its own resort. You don't have to go to a remote cottage or cabin. You don't have to escape from the city. This is that neighborhood in Stockholm, a winter city like ours. And imagine being a kid growing up in that city and having access to all those things just outside your door. And this of course, is your city. And I've just been fascinated to see this dialogue between the Riverwalk and East Village and the great success that's being experienced there. Cities have the capacity to innovate in all kinds of interesting ways. This is a system which is now being introduced in Montreal, which comes from Sweden and hopefully will spread across Canada. It's also in the States, of a vacuum tubes under the streets to collect garbage and direct it to all kinds of recycling streams and conversion of waste to energy. And so rather than having garbage trucks rumbling around the city, what you have in every neighborhood is these little portals, and you simply drop in your garbage, and at 70 kilometers an hour, it's whisked away. It's never seen, it's never smelled, and it pays for itself in a very short period of time. So the key is this is not, as I think you can see by now, it's not about one thing. It's about the interactive whole. It's about having a vision for where your city is going, one that is tangible, one that people can see and touch. And this watercolor that we prepared for St. Paul has served as a kind of guidepost for people as the transformation occurred. I'm currently working in Edmonton with the city staff on a framework that will take all of the many projects that are going on downtown and create a similar vision and framework that will show them all in relationship to each other. This process of transformation, which is fascinating, which is exhilarating, is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And it's a multi-generational change. It took us many generations to do what we've done to our city centers and the sprawl that we've created around them, but it's cumulative. And what it means is the stewardship of this has to extend beyond any single political administration. It has to be something where civil society, folks like yourselves, are engaged in, and can't rely only on the politicians to be the stewards of this kind of change. Very importantly, it is not optional. This is really a matter of our survival on the planet. We live in a very privileged world in North America, but we live in a world where soon 80% of the world's population, we're going from 50 to 80 in a relatively short period of time, will be living in cities. Look at the density of red and where it is on that map. And if we're not able to solve these problems in cities, we really don't have a chance. And finally, it can't be just top down. It has to be done in a way in our world where the decisions to make these important changes, these interlocking changes, has to happen democratically in a political space that reflects how we are actually living and will live in cities. And I can say in my generation and people in the room who are my age or some maybe even older, we made quite a mess of the world in 2.5 generations. We're handing it off to those young people you see in this photograph. They have a big job to do, and we have to contribute to that. Thanks very much.